of research experience, just in terms of backgrounds?
Yep. Just from,
and I would say also too, just the other day in dividing up them for their research teams, Dr. Vaughn, it seems as though as I believe as a result of COVID, that's what I'm going to suggest. That is the rationale, is that these folks probably had more exposure to research because it was something that could be done more easily virtually. Okay. So actually when they self-reported their experiences, some people haven't had much research experience because it's not been part of their world, but those that have been exposed to academic programs have had a pretty decent level of knowledge around needs assessments, standard deviation, sample size, confidence intervals.
Okay, so some good overview, and I'm sure, even within that, a range of experience. What about in terms of qualitative research? Are as a group, is there any kind of gestalt about familiarity with qualitative research? I'd love to just get a sense of kind of where I'm starting.
Yep, Katie's going to chime in on that.
Okay, there I am. Right ones today. I can see me up there. I'm an OT, and OT loves qualitative research. So we're trying to keep doing that, but do more quantitative. But a lot of our literature based and like things that we've done before are just qualitative information.
Okay, great. You kind of lost a little bit at the end, but it sounded like you were saying overall in OT, you're really comfortable with qualitative research and you're trying to actually do more of quantitative.
Yes, as a profession.
As a profession, I think moving more towards quantitative, but we're really good at qualitative stuff.
Okay, great. So you should jump in for sure then. As I'm talking. And then what about other folks in the room, just kind of a general sense or kind of the range of qualitative experience? Is it something that folks are somewhat familiar with in terms of using qualitative research methods and approaches?
Hi, I'm Amy. I'm
Amy.
like looking around the room and I'm seeing some people shake heads. Some people look excited like they have experience. So it seems like we have a pretty wide range.
Okay. Yeah, and that's all good. This is really it sort of helps me just sort of gauge where folks are. So let me jump in. Let me say a little bit about myself. This is a long time ago when my daughter now is a senior in high school, which is so hard to believe. So she's doing all that crazy teenager stuff that's making me crazy. But I put this up because I wanted to share just a little bit about who I am. I'm trained traditionally as a psychologist. I don't practice clinically at all anymore. I mostly do research. And really, overall, I'm a qualitative and participatory research methodologist. That's kind of an umbrella term. But as my daughter many years ago, when she was very little, said, yeah, hello, my mom doesn't have a good elevator speech. And so I think part of that is because I don't know what I want to be when I grow up. And so I do a lot of different things, even though primarily I try to stay in that lane of qualitative and participatory research methodology. And my primary appointment is at Children's. I'm in emergency medicine, but I also have a joint appointment over at University of Cincinnati, and we have an action research PhD program, which is, for those of you in training, you may not be able to come get an additional PhD, but I love for people to know about our classes in action research and participatory research because it's a great supplement, particularly in the areas that you guys are working in. So it's that idea of doing research with people rather than doing research on people or about people. So not even getting in so much to quantitative and qualitative, but just the overall approach. Anyway, so I like to say a little bit about who I am and maybe reveal some of my hidden secrets that are not so hidden about what I want to be when I grow up. So I like to start here when I talk about qualitative research. So and it links back to my history in psychology. Many years ago, when I was trained in graduate school in psychology, I was trained in quantitative research, and I literally had to sneak around in my graduate program and take qualitative classes outside my department. It was, and I had a professor who said, now you need to keep this on the down low. And so I kind of thought, well, that's kind of funny, because if that's the wildest thing, you know, that I had to keep secret, I guess I'm doing pretty well. Fortunately, that's changed in a lot of programs now, that qualitative research, I don't know if I would say that it's on equal footing with more quantitative approaches, but it certainly has gained a lot of ground from the many years ago when I was in grad school, and qualitative research was really seen as something, you know, not scientific, not rigorous, and really no place for it in the academy. And so I'm really happy to say that has changed. So a little bit about what I hope to do with you guys today. I'm going to do some overview and background that I will certainly share. And then I have some questions peppered in that I will ask you guys for input. And I really appreciate you standing up and yet kind of, I don't know how loud you're speaking, but, you know, really speaking up so I can hear you. That's awesome. And then, you know, along this journey today, I hope to introduce you to some pros and cons of qualitative research, what it is, what it isn't. I want to get into how it's different than quantitative research, since that's what a lot of people have more familiarity with, or what I would say is more valued in the academy, in academics. And then I want to spend a little time, I don't want to get too into the weeds about it, but I do want to spend a little bit of time talking about the different designs in qualitative research, because that's something that maybe folks don't know as much about. And since we have a little more time today, then I thought we'd go there. And then, like I said before, I can absolutely take questions along the way. So please feel free. Okay, so let's start really basic. What is qualitative research? Okay, overall, it is still research. Okay, so we're still generating knowledge, and it's an inquiry approach that tends to be focused. It's a deeper dive in research. So it tends to be focused on a key idea, concept, phenomenon. It's really much broader and more general. So it's not quite as specific as what you're going to see in quantitative research. It's focused on participant viewpoints and perspectives. And typically we're going to see things focused in words or images or artwork even. The idea of reciprocity and respect and mutuality is something that's a cornerstone of qualitative research. In terms of analysis, you're going to see coding for the coding of that often textual or image-based data, looking for description and overall patterns or themes. The interpretation of the data is going to be focused on the meaning of that data, and it's going to be focused on personal reflections and past research. The report or the manuscript or the results that come out of qualitative research involve reflexivity and are iterative and emergent. So something a little different too than quantitative research, and we'll talk more about this, is that the idea with qualitative research is you're not locked in. You may start with a great question guide, for example, if you're going to do interviews, qualitative interviews, but if you do a few interviews and you see that you have 3 or 4 questions that really are not eliciting the types of responses that you would hope for based on the participant inputs thus far, you can actually redo that question guide. And that is expected in qualitative research. And then overall with qualitative research, we're focused on the social construction of meaning. You see a lot more advocacy and collaboration in qualitative research than you would in more traditional quantitative research. Doesn't mean it can't be there in quantitative research. It's just that those ideas are more easily combined with qualitative research approaches. Okay, so I always love to show this example. This is where my teenager would roll her eyes because she would say, "Mom, you're so extra." But I love this, and I've used this for a long time. This is when qualitative research goes to the farm. And so this is qualitative research from the farm animals and the farmer's perspective. And I think it hits a number of ideas about what qualitative research is and the effect that it has on people. So I love what all the animals are saying. And then I love the farmers that are saying, you know, things just aren't the same since that researcher dude was here. Okay, so here's the formal definition of qualitative research. This is from John Creswell. And John Creswell literally has probably written about 60 textbooks on research methods. He's the guru of research methods and really is an expert in a lot of different types of research approaches. And so here's his official definition. And I like to break it down to in a very simple way to say that qualitative research answers what, how, and why versus how much or whether. So we're not talking about cause and effect. We're not talking about the how. We're talking about what, how, and why. So you start to see how that's much more of a deeper dive rather than very, very specific. Okay, so here's a question that I want to ask you guys, and I don't want to get too philosophical here, but I used to teach a philosophy of science class to graduate students, to PhD students. And one of the things that we would talk about, and you know, initially I honestly thought that teaching this class was going to be a big snoozer because I thought, who really wants to know about philosophy of science, like the way we know things? But as I taught it, I kind of got into it. And so I was teaching about it, and we would focus on a lot of different paradigms. So quantitative paradigms, and there's more than what I have here, but quantitative paradigms or philosophies are typically positivist and post-positivist. And so there's a lot of nuance here, but generally that side of things means, if we're going to break it down into kind of a quantitative versus qualitative, the quantitative side is much more about this idea that there is an objective reality and that there are certain truths in the world. And on the qualitative side, it's really more about paradigms that are socially constructed, that meaning is interpreted, that we can take a critical analysis approach to ideas, and that people's perspectives are important, so that there's not one objective reality. There are many realities, and it depends on who's saying what the reality is. Okay, so those are very, very loose ways of kind of talking about the two sets of paradigms, or what I call the philosophical tug of war. And so I want to ask you guys if you generally accept this idea that quantitative research tends to be based on certain scientific paradigms or philosophies or worldviews versus qualitative research being based on other almost opposite paradigms and philosophies. What does this mean? What does it mean for us as researchers that work in academic and research settings? And there's no right answer here. I'm just curious what you guys think.
I was going to say Lisa's a psychologist, so we'll also waiting back. I don't ever want to be like the first one to like jump up, so I just wait. This is Lisa again. I think just kind of the way like the history of psychological research has gone is quantitative is like the true science and it's the real science, whereas qualitative really doesn't have a leg to stand on. So I think it's kind of like the opposites of you can't have both. So quantitative is the accurate one.
Yeah, so it's, I mean, it's more valued, it's, right, people look down their nose at qualitative research, yeah. And so I thank you for offering that. And so if that's generally the case, what does that mean for people maybe who are using qualitative research or who really support the value of qualitative research? Not necessarily in place of quantitative research, but what do you think it means for those of us that really kind of tend to operate in the qualitative world over the quantitative?
This is Amy. I think typically like you have to defend it a lot more. It can be harder to get published in like non-qualitative specific journals. So it takes a little bit more explanation to get people to see the value.
Yeah, and so I think these are all right, you know, and I think especially, I guess when I was younger and kind of early in my research career, it's hard to say, you know, is it that the times have changed a little bit? Is it also that I was so new? But, you know, I think I used to feel that qualitative researchers tended to have a little bit of a chip on their shoulders because they always were defending what they do. And, you know, maybe I don't care as much about this anymore. and so that's part of it. But I think there's also been a little bit of turning of the tide so that it's a little bit more accepted. And so there's room for both. But I think part of where I come from is that there's no one best research approach. My idea is that, and what I try to train my own PhD students is, you want to have a full research toolkit. So I'm not telling you, well, today I'm talking about kind of obviously the pros, and I'm emphasizing the advantages of qualitative research. I'm also talking about some of the limitations and challenges. But I don't think qualitative research is ideal for everything, and it's not ideal for every project. What I try to teach is you want to use the research approach that best answers your research question and considers where the wisdom is, and you know who is best to answer the research question that you have. And sometimes that answer is, well, it lies in the patients, the family members, the parents, the community members. And so a lot of times it's much more effective and honoring of that wisdom if you use, in part at least, a qualitative research approach, because it's a lot easier for many folks who are untrained in research to be part of qualitative research. And you know, I could spend a lot more time on this that goes into some of the advantages and pros of using participatory research approaches. Okay, so I like to just kind of throw that out there to say, you know, it's not just a rosy picture here. And so there can be, you know, still some defending of qualitative research, and, you know, you don't walk into every circle in academics and have it be fully accepted. I still do have to defend qualitative research in some cases, although where we are now compared to way back when I was in grad school, totally different place. I don't have to sneak around anymore. So this is the writing is a little bit fuzzy there, but this is Dr. Smith, I think. And he's levitating in the air, and it's a little bit of a joke here, kind of like, you know, Dr. Smith is the head of the qualitative research department, we'll say. And so everybody's looking at him like, wow, what's he up to? Levitating in the air, weirdo in a, looks like a toga or something. And so why should we bother with qualitative research? And so it's for some of the reasons that I was just telling you. The other reason, and I always like to share this example, this is a personal professional example of a colleague of mine who, he is an anesthesiologist by training. Although I tell him that anesthesiology is his hobby, because what he's really amazing at is basically being a computer hacker. He is incredible at coding, and he writes his own code to do undulating graphs and things that move on the screen based on statistics. And I mean, he can wrap his head around things that there's just no hope for me in that arena. And so I met this colleague many years ago because he had done some work. He used to be at Cincinnati Children's and now has moved on to CHOP. But when he was at Cincinnati Children's, he did a lot of work about surgery cancellation. And so you guys know, right? Surgery cancellation is kind of a big deal if you start to think about it, because, well, you tell me, why is surgery cancellation at any hospital a big deal?
Time and money.
Yeah, right. Basically, and a lot of money. I mean, surgery is expensive. The OR is expensive. So I was shocked when I kind of knew that generally, but I was shocked, and I won't be able to recall the exact numbers, but I was shocked when I learned how much per minute hospitals are spending for children's surgery because of the OR, the surgeons, the nurses, the anesthesiologists, and so forth and so on, right? And I'm leaving out a lot of the other roles. So it's expensive, and all of that has to be booked ahead. And so if there is a cancellation, especially the day of, that's really hard to do anything about, because you've got, you can't adults too, you can't eat, you can't drink, right? There's all these restrictions. So it's not like they can just call somebody up and say, oh, okay, Lisa, Amy, come on in for surgery, or bring your kid in for surgery today. You've got 2 hours. Well, you already fed your kid oatmeal or whatever, right? So just not a possibility. Anyway, so long story short, this colleague of mine had done a lot of work, and he had done all this stuff with hot spotting and percentages and mining the health charts and all of this. And his whole idea was he wanted to be able to predict who was going to cancel surgery to try to save the hospital a lot of money. And, selfishly, to save him being booked for a procedure as an anesthesiologist and then showing up and having, his whole schedule messed up when somebody didn't show up for surgery. So really big deal, really important work. And this starts to show some of what he learned. Even as a result of the work that he was doing, they did some changes. And some of these changes were things like text messages, and they made these pretty charts about what you can eat and drink and what you can't and what's the problem, right? They were just trying to make it as clean and clear as possible. Here's an example. He did some heat maps, these are called, looking at the distribution geographically and looking at race, ethnicity. So literally my colleague had this down to, at the time, he could tell you within a very high degree of certainty that the month of, I forgot now, but I think it might have been November. The month of November on this day, from this neighborhood, from this race, ethnicity. I mean, he could tell you with pretty great precision about who was going to cancel surgery. So awesome, right? The hospital got really excited about this. But what is the big problem here? What's the fatal flaw in all this?
If it doesn't happen?
Well, that's kind of what drove this, right? If it doesn't happen. But what's the sort of, if you think about it from like, what's missing here? What's the gap here?
I was going to say, I think there's a lot of factors as to why someone would cancel an appointment. And so we don't know the various other factors. We just know race, geography, and all these things. And that doesn't take into account family and other components that are huge factors for healthcare.
Right. So that's exactly right. We don't have the individual parent and family context here, or the explanation of why. All we have is what is written down in an electronic health record. And you can be awesome at coding and doing all these cool moving charts and all this kind of stuff, but it only gives you very limited data and information, and you still don't know the why. you still don't know the details of the why or the context of those family units or those kids and parents. And so my colleague, who is clearly like one of the smartest people I know in a lot of arenas, realized like, oh, I got to talk to people. And so somebody, he said that, and somebody said, oh yeah, you're not good at that. You're an anesthesiologist. You put people to sleep so you don't have to talk to them. And so he jokingly, somebody told him, you need to meet Lisa Vaughn. And so that's how we actually met, and we became great friends and colleagues. And then started to look at this from a deeper level, because I said right away, well, this is so cool. I would never be able to do any of this, but you got to talk to people. You got to talk to parents. And so I won't go through all the details, but we ended up doing a qualitative supplement to the work that he had already done, where we interviewed different kinds of parents who had canceled surgery within a certain period of time. And what came out of this is called personas. And this is just one of the examples. I'm leaving out a lot of the details. And a persona is a fictional composite of the different types of people that we interviewed. So Monica here doesn't represent a single person. Monica represents a group of parents, of prototypical parents. And so we learned some themes and patterns about people who are like Monica in this persona. And so overall, again, I'm leaving out a lot of the details, but I share that example because qualitative research as an approach to research is good for these types of things: generating aims, right? Exploring and describing in detail social phenomena, and really capturing diverse perspectives and voices that maybe are not typically heard or not quite as engaged in the research process. We know that a lot of minoritized populations are not willing to engage in research because of a long legacy of distrust. And, I won't go through all of that history, but so there's a lot of good reason. And qualitative research can be more welcoming and more engaging for some folks. Qualitative research is good for identifying important variables or concepts. It's good for recognizing relationships and patterns. You can generate theories and hypotheses from qualitative research. And it's really great for areas of work where there's not a lot of research or theories, or it's very limited, or maybe it's limited in certain populations. Here's another way of saying what I've been saying, which is that qualitative research is really more for that in-depth contextualized picture of a phenomenon, whereas quantitative research is much more narrow and we're interested in generalizable trends. Here's a list of characteristics of qualitative research. I'll let you read through those. Okay, and then I'd like to just talk about, I don't want to go into too much detail because it sounds like you have some experience in the room around both quantitative and qualitative research, but I want to just kind of pit quantitative versus qualitative, and just to give you an idea of the contrast and kind of what qualitative research is about versus quantitative. And so if you take a look on the right-hand side, you're going to see this idea of patterns, naturalistic, inductive, emergent, descriptive, versus on the left, you see more about deductive, reduction, control, hypotheses, right? Or starting with hypotheses. So now with this general intro, I first want to stop and see what questions do you have or what clarifications. We're going to go into a lot more detail, but I want to move to an activity, because I think one of the best ways, I'm literally a talking head up on your screen saying blah, 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 right? One of the best ways I think to really learn about any kind of research is to take a look at some examples. And so I want to move to an activity, but I want to see if you have any general questions before we do that. Anybody itching to say something or have a question? Anything I've said that doesn't resonate or doesn't make sense so far? Okay, everybody okay? Flap your hands in the air or something so I know that everybody's okay. Okay. Thank you. Okay. So can you guys help me out in there then with dividing up groups? Were you thinking 6 groups, 6 small groups?
Did you say you wanted 3, Lisa? Like 3 in a group?
Yeah, that's fine. The other thing is, will they be able to pull up those articles?
Yes. Yeah, the groups most of them have laptops.
Okay.
They
Perfect.
can pull it up on
Okay.
Canvas.
Yeah, so 3 people in a group is great. And
Okay.
what I was thinking is if you can just designate, group 1 will choose whatever order those articles that I sent are in, just have group 1 choose the first article and link to, take a look at that, and group 2, the second article, and so forth and so on. Does that make sense?
Okay. Yep, that works.
Yeah, so let me say what I'm going to have you do, and then maybe they can help with groups. So if you see here up on the screen, what I'd like each of these small groups to do is I want you to take a look at the article, because these are published manuscripts, and I'm not necessarily saying these are all wonderful 100% purist exemplar articles of qualitative research, but they all are solid, decent examples of qualitative research. And so what I'd like you to take a look at, you're not going to have time to read in depth the whole article. You can certainly do that later at your leisure, but skim through the article and particularly take a look at the end of the intro, background, and the method section. I mean, of course, glance through the whole article, but really what I'd like you to pay attention to is, why did the researchers do this particular research, and what was their rationale, whether it's explicitly stated or implicitly implied about using a qualitative research approach? Why do you think they used a qualitative research approach? Sometimes they say it, sometimes they don't. And then take a look at what data sources did they use for data collection? Who were the experts really? Who were the participants? What did the data analysis look like? What was the role of researcher, whether they stated or not? And maybe sometimes it's just implied. How did they validate or legitimize the qualitative research? Did they share anything about that? And then just anything else that stands out to you about the qualitative research approach in the article. Okay, so try to, even though it's embedded in a particular content, try to not let the content sway so much of your discussion, and instead focus on the qualitative research aspects. Any questions?
I can't see the articles. I just see that last slide.
Yeah, so the articles, I think, Steph.
Leah, do you have access to Canvas right now, Leah?
Yes.
So they should be posted on Canvas under today's module, under activity.
Okay.
And Lisa, I'll go ahead and start getting people in groups.
Yeah, that would be great. So we'll spend, I think let's do 10 minutes in the groups. I know that's not a ton of time. So I think, taking a look at these. So I'd love to invite someone that maybe we haven't heard from to share just a little bit from your group about what you noticed in your article. You can give us maybe a one-liner of what your article was focused on. And then just tell us, you don't need to go through every question that I have up here, but just tell us maybe something that you noticed or you thought your article did particularly well in the qualitative research realm.
This is Katie again. I talk too much because I'm a wooer. So I'm going to take the microphone to a table that we haven't heard from yet.
Oh,
Sorry,
great. Thank you.
friends. Going this way.
Katie gets some extra credit. Make sure they give you some extra credit points. Thank you.
Sorry, guys.
So yeah, tell me, give us a one-liner about your article. What was the content? And then why don't you share something, again, you don't have to share the whole conversation, but share something that stood out to you guys or you thought the authors did really well.
Hi, I'm Ramya. The article we got talks about how the critical care nurses having like this monitoring alarm customization thing, and they use an interpretative descriptive study. In this, they discuss about like in the hospitals they have these alarm systems where like if a patient blood pressure or something like that like changes, it makes an alarm to the nurses. So how this causing the fatigue to the nurses, because sometimes the false alarms may occur, and like how the other patients are like responding to it when it happens. So in the end, what they concluded by this study is like nurses want these alarm thing like to be customized, because some of the patient already have high blood pressure or something. So even though it's like not like normal for that person compared to others, but it will lead to the false alarm. So it make like what they think is like it's better to customize the alarm system for each patient, because by the time like they're working with them, they will get a basic idea of the physiology of how the patient works and stuff. So it will help them to have less fatigue and manage this.
Yeah, and so I think it goes without saying, but you know, for the rest of the group there, everybody listening, why would something like this, why would we need a qualitative research approach to understanding this research question or this research issue? Or what does it give us to do this using a qualitative research approach?
Can I answer that question too?
Sure.
Like I think now the technology is like advancing, and many times like it's changes most of the times, but the people who already working been there, they have to learn the new stuff, and everything changes, and it kind of getting complicated for the people who are like already been there and they don't have like much idea about the new technology and how to handle those things.
Yeah.
So like if they're like new to that and don't know how to handle things, they will definitely get panic if they're like alarm keep on going on and it will disturb the other patients and they don't know how to react to them.
Yeah, so we have to understand how people are experiencing it, whether it's the providers, the healthcare providers, or the patients and families, and the effect of the alarms on them, right? And the only way I would argue that we can understand that the actual effect on them is to ask them. I mean, we have to talk to both the providers and the caregivers or parents and get a sense of how they experience these alarms, right? And the monitors and what the effect is. There's lots of data that's there, I'm sure, that you know, can document when the alarms go off, when the monitors are used, how quickly people respond, but that only gives us one part of the story. So to really get the full story, we have to talk to the people who are living these alarms and monitors day to day. Great. Why don't we take one other group, and then whoever just spoke, you now have the power to take that mic to somebody else.
Swear everybody looks away.
I was chosen. Okay, so we were looking at the article about overdiagnosis in breast cancer screening. And so for this, they basically wanted to get an understanding of what women understand about overdiagnosis and breast cancer screening, which is basically picking up on breast cancer through screening that might not actually present clinically over the lifetime. And so then it is then kind of addressed unnecessarily. And so they did a lot of focus groups, which we thought was a particular strength. They like age stratified them and used the questions they used were developed by like multidisciplinary teams. And thank you. And yeah, and then the focus groups were audio recorded and then transcribed verbatim, and then kind of a thematic analysis was done on that. So we thought this was a good, strong way of kind of getting a good idea of understanding, because people were able to kind of supply understanding and then build off of each other if they had differing point of views, which wouldn't happen if it wasn't kind of within this focus group setting.
Yeah, great. And I love that too, because I think sometimes people choose focus groups because they think, oh, well, that's the only thing I've ever heard of that's qualitative, focus groups or interviews. And sometimes the focus group is not really warranted because maybe it, building off of one another's ideas, or maybe in certain populations, being in a focus group would be way too distracting for the individuals, right? I mean, you could think of different folks with different things going on, that focus groups may be a really bad idea. And so I like that you point out that, in this case, there was a benefit of people building on one another's ideas, and that it seemed to be a comprehensive way to answer the research question or the purpose of this study. So I want to stop there in terms of the examples, and now with all of the examples that you looked at, you have some concrete things to keep in mind as I talk about the rest of the slides. My idea was I would share a few more slides and then ask if you guys either wanted to do a break or finish early. So is that okay if I continue for just a few minutes more? Can you hang on?
Yes.
Okay. And then we'll kind of see where we are. Okay. Let's see. Now my screen is not doing what I need it to. Okay. So I want to go through again a little bit of some examples, thinking about quantitative versus qualitative, just to make the comparison. So first, the intent of qualitative research is different. You see that here on the right compared to quantitative research. And keep in mind, as we're going through this, not only the article you just looked at as an example of qualitative research, but keep in mind what I said earlier about qualitative, any kind of research approach is really, you should choose the approach that best answers your research question. And if you think about qualitative research, it's really good at answering the what and why of something. So in terms of the focus of the research, qualitative research tends to be focused on open-ended questions, understanding complexity, developing a theory, for example. Use literature and qualitative research to justify the problem or issue that you're focused on. And the literature identifies theory that informs the research. It kind of gives a sense of the lens that you're using. Data sources for qualitative tend to be interviews, observations, they can be documents, they can be more visual, audio-visual, photos, videos, for example. In terms of data collection, again, qualitative research is focused on words and images. You tend to have a smaller sample size. You're focused on naturalistic settings, so you're not bringing people typically into a lab or into the hospital for qualitative research. You could, but generally you want to think about qualitative research happening in the settings where people live, work, study, seek healthcare, etc. I mentioned this before, but with qualitative research, there's an iterative and emergent procedure. And so again, I know I've said this several times already, but qualitative methods are indicated when the research question or questions require them. And so, for example, a quantitative research question or hypothesis typically is what we're going to see with quantitative, might compare the outcomes of an intervention for two different groups. So how does X therapy compare, contrast for this population or the group versus this other group, for example? And then a qualitative research question might think more about a smaller subset of participants who are in an intervention and getting their sense of their impressions, their experiences, what it was like to be in one of the arms of the intervention. So that's an example of an intervention study and how it might look different. In terms of data analysis, in the broadest sense, qualitative research is going to be more looking for patterns and across the text or across the visual data. There's going to be a coding process that's used, and depending on the different type of analysis approach, that can get that takes different forms. But generally, in all qualitative research, you're going to do some kind of coding and analysis, and that is going to involve looking for those patterns and maybe the interrelationships among the themes. There's a lot of different ways to do it. You can use a more advanced qualitative methodology, for example, is called portraiture. And it's not necessarily the literal painting of pictures. It's more about thinking about portraits of people that demonstrate a particular experience or phenomenon. And there's details for how to do that methodology, etc. Here's a very, very basic example comparing quantitative and qualitative research results. And sometimes I just try to simplify things in case there's some confusion. On the left, you might see a Likert scale that asks a question about difficulty of coping with chronic illness. And then it might be a whole questionnaire about coping with chronic illness, or it might be one question. And so you can see for this one question, you would get some descriptive statistics that show you the percentage and maybe the raw number and what this looked like across your sample. On the right, you see an example of a quotation from a qualitative approach that shares the experience of what it's like to cope with a chronic illness. So very different approach, pros and cons to both. And again, go back to what kind of research question or what type of thing are you trying to understand? The role of the researcher is different in qualitative research. The researcher is the instrument of data collection. We tend to own up to our biases and our positionality, it's called in qualitative research. And that's something, it's absolutely existing in quantitative research, but you just typically don't talk about it or write about it when you're doing more of a strict quantitative approach to research. There are ways that we legitimate or validate the data in qualitative research. We call instead of reliability and validity, in qualitative research, we tend to call it trustworthiness and credibility, and then sometimes transferability. So to end this part of the PowerPoint, I will just summarize by saying there's three main differences in when you consider quantitative versus qualitative research. Typically in the research aims, the aims themselves are going to be for a different intent or a different reason. The goal of qualitative research is not generalizability. And I think that is probably the one thing that more, we'll just say the haters, the qualitative research haters, and maybe people who are firmly only in a quantitative siloed camp, they will use the idea of generalizability to invalidate all of qualitative research. But in fact, generalizability is not the goal. We're focused much more on local context and understanding certain groups than we are looking at those broad generalizable trends. There's some exception, but that's another talk in qualitative research. But by and large, qualitative research, that's not the intent, and really shouldn't be. Sample size is going to be different in qualitative research. You're going to have a much smaller sample because of that focus on the localized context. Now, there's some variation with different qualitative designs. So like if you're doing grounded theory in qualitative research, your sample size is going to be larger than it might be in an ethnography or a case study approach in qualitative research. The other concept that comes up with sample size is the idea of saturation. This just does not exist really in quantitative research. So saturation is really the notion of informational redundancy. And so, for example, if you're doing interviews, saturation would be the point at which you may plan for, let's say, 25 to 30 interviews that really you think will best capture the group or the phenomena that you're trying to understand, or a particular group of patients, for example. And let's say you propose 25 to 30 interviews. Well, you might be able to stop at 25 interviews because what you're seeing as you're going through an iterative coding and analysis process is that the overall patterns that are emerging are really, you're not getting any new information. And so you can feel comfortable that at the 25 interviews, you've reached saturation of the major ideas and patterns in those interviews. If you haven't and new information is still coming up, it suggests that you need to go further and you may need to do another handful of interviews or 10 more interviews. So it's the idea of saturation. And then let me move my bar here. The sampling strategies is the third area of major difference. And so it is not that you can't use randomized sampling in qualitative research, but generally that's not the purpose, because if you go back to the first research aims, if we're not focused on generalizability, in other words, we don't want to generalize to larger groups or populations. If we're focused on local context, we're going to tend to use more purposeful sampling. And so we're going to be more focused on making sure that we get the diversity of the voices that we want in that qualitative research project, rather than looking at those broad representative samples, if that makes sense. Okay, so I'm gonna stop there before, and there's more that I wanna say, but I wanna do a check-in. First, I wanna see if there's any question about anything that I've just thrown at you. Let me pause for a minute for any questions.
I do have a question. Can you hear me?
You might need the microphone.
Oh, okay.
This one. So I have a question regarding the sampling strategies. So basically you come up with a number like, oh, I think 20 will be great for my research, or is there any other way? Or like you look examples of things that have been done before? Like how do you come up with a number?
Yeah, no, it's a really great question. And honestly, probably in my career, that is one of the top questions that I've been asked over and over and over. So, you know, I'm going to give you the short answer. If you were taking my advanced qualitative methods class and, you really wanted to do a deep dive, I would have more to say than you would ever want to hear, probably. Okay. But the short answer is, typically you base your sample size in qualitative research on either previous research that you've done that's qualitative with similar groups or populations. If you haven't done that research, then you look to the literature and get a sense of when qualitative studies have been done with, let's say you're focused on kids with autism, for example. And let's say you're trying to understand something. I'm really making stuff up here because it's not my area, but let's maybe say you're trying to understand something about executive functioning in children who have autism, something like that. So you would look to the literature to see, okay, when qualitative studies have been done in that group and with, related to the topic that you're interested in. First of all, how have they done that? How have they collected data with those kids and families? And then what kinds of sample size did they have when it was a qualitative research study? So you get a sense of what's out there. There are some more advanced concepts called, so some of you have heard of calculating power in statistics, right? To generate what sample size you need. Well, in qualitative research, there's something that's known as informational power. So it's akin to the idea of power in statistics. But it's a little bit more complex in terms of estimating what kind of sample size you need. And so what a lot of folks do, myself including, and I do have some of that previous experience to fall back on, is I will say things like, let's say in a grant proposal, based on previous research with similar populations, we anticipate a sample size of 25 to 30, if I'm using interviews or whatever, 25 to 30 interviews will be sufficient to reach saturation. However, and then I explain a little bit about saturation, right, with all the right references, and then say, however, we understand that if saturation is not reached, we may have to add additional interviews, right? And I would try to say that in a little bit more eloquent language. So does that start to answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
And the other slide, it was talking about if they're trustworthy, if they're reliable. Now, are we blindly going into that, or do we do a little research to see if this person has been consistent with other studies or participated in other studies and to see how they did? Or are we just out here saying, we just trust you? Or not doing any type of
it's a great question. It's and really in qualitative research, again, it's a different way that we talk about validating data. And so trustworthiness is, you can achieve trustworthiness in qualitative research by doing something called member checking, where you go back and check, so after the results have been analyzed in qualitative research, you can go back to your participants and say, here are the overarching themes we found from our focus group study or from our large group assessment study, whatever study you did. And you can say, does that match what your experience was? Does that reflect what you feel like you shared with us? So that's one way that you can achieve trustworthiness and credibility. And basically what you're saying is that we believe that these qualitative research findings or results adequately represent what the participants told us, that we didn't just run off and code and analyze and put our own bias on those results. We want to make sure that they reflect what people actually shared. Does that make sense?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so let me now do a check-in. Would you like to keep going and then we'll end about 4:50, or would you like to take a quick break? And I don't care either way, just tell me what your preference is. How many people, raise your hand if you would like to take a 5-minute break right now. And I can't see your hand, so somebody, Katie, you were the microphone person. Tell me how many people are raising their hands.
I think there's no one raising their hand.
Okay, so can I assume that means let's keep going?
Yeah.
Is that okay?
Yes.
Okay, so why don't we keep going? And if you are desperate to go to the bathroom, please do that. Please do that on your own. Okay, so I'm going to keep going, and then I promise we'll end early. Okay, and thanks for you guys hanging in there with me. Okay, so goals of qualitative research. I know I've said versions of this in different ways, but I'm kind of building in redundancy in what I'm saying to give an overall flavor here. So understand meaning, understand the particular context or the influences of context, understand the process by which events and actions take place, and identify new ideas, phenomena, influences, right? There's some very practical advantages of qualitative research. I was going to ask you guys, but I think hopefully they're a little bit obvious at this point. I think with qualitative research, there's a very pragmatic nature to it. Anybody can immediately understand qualitative research, right? People love to talk about their experiences with things, good, bad, and ugly. People like to share that. And if we can summarize that, I'm not saying it's necessarily the easiest thing in the world to do analysis on qualitative data, but if we can, as researchers, summarize that in a great way, and there's some good ways to do that within qualitative research, it makes sense to people when we share it with the world. And sometimes that's more valuable than numbers. Again, I'm not saying that there's not a place for quantitative research, that there's not a place for statistics. And in fact, I do a lot of mixed methods research where I'm using both quantitative and qualitative research. But I think sometimes qualitative research really is much more provocative and gets people engaged in research in ways both in the data collection and in the dissemination, in ways that quantitative just is not ever going to be able to do. Qualitative research is super helpful when a lot of you guys are going to be doing programs, developing interventions. And so one of the things that you have to know when you research an intervention or a program is you have to know how well it worked and how people responded to it. So it's qualitative research gives you a great way to get all those things around feasibility, acceptability, relevance to the people participating in your program or intervention. So it's great for stuff like that. Also, my particular bias too is that I do, as I mentioned earlier, very beginning, I do participatory research, community-based participatory research. And so it's about doing research with participants. So they are actually acting many times in some of my work as co-researchers, people who are not trained in research, but they offer valuable community perspectives. And so, for example, we have a Latinx immigrant community research team, Latinos Unidos por la Salud, LUSALUD, and they work as our co-researchers to understand issues in the Latino community versus us being the data collectors. They are working with us both in the design, the data collection, the analysis, and the dissemination. And so qualitative research often can give folks such as our LUSALUD co-researchers a way to be more involved in the research. And you don't have to do it, by the way, you don't have to have full-blown team of co-researchers throughout the whole process to be participatory. You may decide that it makes sense for your research question to involve partners in certain aspects or certain steps of the research. So I don't want to imply that it has to be full-blown to count in that way. Here, according to Morse and Richards, they are famous qualitative researchers. Here are 5 reasons to use qualitative methods. Again, a different way to really talk about the rationale for qualitative methods. I'll let you read through those. And you should start to see that some of the same words that I've already said over and over. Okay. Here's kind of going into a little bit more about research questions. I like to show this figure from Creswell because what I like about it is it really shows that research is the same. It's the same process. And I could add boxes to this. I could put sub boxes. I could add all sorts of things. But when you set up research, you're really doing the same process. And it's only as you go through and start to figure out, okay, I want to best answer my research question. So then I need to think about, am I going to use a qualitative research approach? Am I going to use a quantitative research approach, or both? Am I going to combine them because I get something in the combination that I can't get by itself? And then and only then do you figure out within each of those, okay, well, what kind of design are you going to use? And then based on that, you figure out, okay, now what kind of sampling or instruments or data collection, what kind of analysis process am I going to use? And so this is just a really nice, I keep this figure in my mind because it reminds me that everything needs to hang together. So here's an example. This gets used all the time in qualitative research. It's called the waiting study, and it's about liver transplants. And so the way this is set up is the problem or the issue is that for those experiencing liver failure, there's great consequences, right? There's serious health consequences. And you can justify, you can give the statistics, and you can provide any existing research on patients who've undergone this liver transplant. The big gap in all of this, though, or at least back in 2006, is that no one had examined the experience of waiting for that liver transplant and what that's like for people. And so who might benefit from this research, from this qualitative research? Members of transplant teams who could support patients and improve outcomes. So again, kind of breaking it down and to go back to this gives you a way of thinking about, okay, all of these pieces hang together for arguing for that qualitative research approach. Very briefly, and I don't want to get in the weeds here because there's all sorts of wisdom about this and ways that people handle it. In general, what you're supposed to do with qualitative research is have research questions, not hypotheses. However, there are plenty of examples in qualitative research, and sometimes it's because of who the audience is. If it's a grant funder, for example, there are plenty of examples where hypotheses are used in qualitative research, but it's technically not correct. Okay, also very briefly, I want to talk about some of the different designs and approaches to qualitative research, not to go into details, but just so that you've seen them and heard them. Because I think this is probably, if I get one other question a lot, it's about, well, wait, am I doing qualitative research and just doing general qualitative research, or am I doing phenomenology, or am I doing an ethnography? So people get confused about some of the different designs within qualitative research. They're all qualitative research, but they're set up a little differently, and they kind of have slightly different purposes. In general, here's what it looks like. There are 5 main designs, but honestly, even Creswell, who I mentioned before, who's written all those books, depending on which book you look at, sometimes he mentions 38 designs and sometimes he mentions 5. So 5 is easier for me to hold in my brain. So that's what I tend to focus on. And when I teach graduate level qualitative methods, one of his books that I use, I forget the exact title, but it's one of my favorite textbooks to use. It's Qualitative Research, the 5 primary designs, I think, or something like that. And these are the 5: narrative, case study, ethnography, phenomenology, and grounded theory. They're all types of qualitative research. There are other types of qualitative research, and sometimes they're just general interview studies or focus group studies. Sometimes you see action research combined, or an action research study that uses a qualitative data collection, for example. So it can get very complex very quickly. But in general, if you focus on the 5 different types, as I said, they are still qualitative research. They answer qualitative research questions in research, but they're a little different in terms of the execution and exactly how you collect data, what the sample should look like, how big it should be. And then the coding and analysis process may have a few nuances to it. But in general, you're still doing very much the same thing. I'm not going to spend time going through each of these, but I wanted you to just know that there's different ways to do it. The other thing I want to mention is, and I've already alluded to this as well, is that there's a lot of different ways and sources of data and data collection techniques that you can use within qualitative research. To me, it's one of the most exciting things about qualitative research is that you're not stuck. You don't have to just do interviews or just do focus groups. Sometimes that's a great option for the study that you're proposing and for your research question. Sometimes using photo voice or photographs to get at your research question is awesome. Sometimes I use, and one of my favorite methodologies is called group level assessment, GLA. And I know in the past, some folks in Lind have used GLA. It's a large group qualitative and participatory methodology where you get a bunch of different stakeholders together and they answer questions and then in real time actually analyze the data themselves. I don't call it analysis when they're together, but they're actually participating in both generating the data and analyzing the data. And there's a structured process that you go through. Those are a few examples. When you're choosing data sources, I always like to say, go back to a commandment, this, thou shalt not engage in methodolatry. I heard the word methodolatry and I just thought that was really great. And I think I might be guilty of it. Sometimes you hear, like, as I did, oh, photo voice? Seriously? People use cameras and photographs as research? That's so cool. And so I heard about that. And a lot of times I'll have students who hear about photo voice and then immediately all they want to do is photo voice for every research project. And so I would say, don't do that. That's not a good idea, because photo voice may not be the best choice for what you're trying to understand. Sometimes it is, and that's awesome. So don't get too distracted by the bright, shiny new methodology or new data collection technique that you hear about. Instead, try to think about choosing data sources that really answer your research question and also work well with the people that you most want to hear from, who are the experts in answering that research question. If it's patients and they have a certain diagnosis or a certain set of skills and abilities that tend to be, part of their disease or their diagnosis, then you want to think about what is going to be a good source to collect data with or from them. I've mentioned that when you analyze qualitative data, there's some common features, and generally you're going to be doing some bit of all of these. They might be called different things depending on the particular qualitative design, but generally you're doing coding, you're reflecting on the meaning, you're typically using displays of some sort, tables, maybe figures, you're looking for patterns, generalization, not to be confused with generalizability, and then theorizing or kind of taking it to that next level about what's the meaning underneath the themes. What does this mean? And it might be at the level of a theory or a model, but it may not be, but you're still kind of thinking in that way. As I mentioned, trustworthiness in qualitative research, there's different ways to do that. And I won't go into details here, but these are some of the concepts that if we were going to go in depth, we would talk about how to execute these as you're doing qualitative research to ensure that, as I said before, the findings that you get really fit what the people shared with you. There's ways to do these validity checks, and I won't go into details here. And then the last thing that I want to mention, and I provided this as one of the resources that I sent ahead of time just so that you would have it. Increasingly, there are different quality criteria, programs or reports that you can use. Sometimes in much more technical journals, they will actually require that you submit one of these quality criteria reports along with your qualitative study. And basically, it's a set of questions that ask you to kind of make sure you've done a high quality qualitative research. It's a little tricky with all those qualitative words there. And one of the common ones is this CASP, Critical Appraisal Skills Program. And that's the one that I provided you, where you can actually fill it out when you're doing a qualitative study. And you don't have to do that, but I do think this is a great way to ask yourself questions when you're thinking about using qualitative research and just ensuring that you've addressed all the key aspects. Okay, so now back to you guys for a minute. I want to ask you, given everything that I've thrown at you, given the articles you looked at, given your own experiences in your disciplines and areas, what are the big challenges and problems that you see with qualitative research? Because there are some. And I'd love to invite folks that haven't spoken into the microphone. Where's Katie? Who has the microphone? I
do.
work.
Hi.
Oh, good. Have we heard from you?
No, you have not heard
Hi.
from me.
What's your name?
Suma.
Hi, Suma.
Hi. So one challenge might be if there's it's hard to kind of judge, and some people may be very number focused in like the research community. So it might be hard to kind of like measure qualitative research and maybe like convince some of those people who are more number focused.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think probably that's going to be an ongoing task, although it's easier now than it used to be. I will say, back when I used to walk to school in the snow with no shoes and all that, right? I always feel like that's how I'm talking. But yeah, I think you're always going to have to do a little bit of a defense and argument about why qualitative research. And, sometimes what I say is, hey, do mixed methods. Mixed methods then is best practice. And so you're getting the best of both worlds. Maybe you have a quantitative aim and you have a qualitative aim. And then you just make sure that you integrate both of those. It's also a great way to understand something, from different perspectives. What else? What are some of the other potential challenges? Suma, you get to take the microphone to somebody else. But some of the youth that I work with, they call it popcorning. And so they say you get to popcorn it to somebody else.
Hey, my name is Greg.
Hey.
I wanted to be able to say this before, with being able to advocate for autism. I kind of feel like one of the potential problems with qualitative research is to make sure that you're not leaning too far into being able to sugarcoat things for people, even though you kind of want to be able to tell them that there's a light side to being able to go through the process of autism, while at the same time you want to make sure that you go into the research. Otherwise, people will just be scratching their heads, be like, does this person know what they're talking about? Like, what in the world?
Yeah. So, I think maybe, I'm not sure I'm understanding. You can tell me if I've got this right or not. But are you saying that like maybe qualitative research is a little too positive or idealistic, maybe that we might paint too rosy of a picture, perhaps?
Well, not exactly. Just mainly just I believe that it's mainly to find a balance between both the negatives and the positives with the research.
Okay. Yeah. And
Instead of just like going into it and just being able to say, hey, it's all right. Your child will be able to be like this and be able to have like a good life, but never really explaining how it would be able to lean towards that way, and how to be able to address the certain barriers to be able to make sure that they get to that certain point.
Yeah, and so thank you very much I for explaining that further. I think you're actually making a great argument for why qualitative research, because to me, if we want to make sure that people understand barriers about any group or any particular issue, we need to talk to those people who are experiencing the barriers and potentially some of the positive or the facilitators, right? So I think qualitative research gives you a good way to do that. And I would argue for sure, I agree wholeheartedly that in all research, whether quantitative, qualitative, or mixed methods, you have to kind of keep that balance in it, really reminding ourselves that it can't all be focused on deficits, but it also likewise can't just be all on the positive side either.
Right.
Yeah, thank you. Other big challenges that you guys can see are pitfalls with qualitative research. So Greg, you get to give the microphone to somebody else. You guys are missing a really, really big one, a big, big problem with qualitative research.
What I was gonna say is that it could just be really time and labor intensive. So it
Yes,
requires a lot of
that's it.
resources.
That's it. Thank you. What's your name?
This is Amy.
Oh, hey, Amy. Good to hear from you again. I can't see. I can't see very well. Yeah, thanks, Amy. That's actually one of the ones that I wanted to mention, because guess what? When you talk to people, and sometimes talking to people is they just, nobody's really asked them about, hey, what's it like to experience XYZ? And all of a sudden they have tons of stuff to say. And so what that means for the qualitative researcher is that you may have tons of data that you then have to analyze. And that can be really hard, especially if you're doing it alone. It works much better when you have a whole team, but it can be time and labor intensive. And what I would argue is you get really great things from qualitative research. So I think it's worth some of the time and labor, but I'm biased as well. But I do think it's something that you have to plan for and think about. So here's some other things that kind of could fall in the potential problem list of qualitative research. So I don't want to have you believe that it's all perfect and, everybody jump in and be qualitative researchers with no issues at all. The key sort of limitations that I've seen and heard about from people in the past, I mentioned really the generalizability before, and then we were just talking about the time consuming piece. And then this subjectivity piece can be an argument for people to say, well, qualitative research is so subjective. How can we be sure that it's accurate? And I was mentioning that there are ways that we can do that and validate our work using those concepts that I mentioned around trustworthiness and credibility. There's some actual ways that we can make that happen. There's also ways that we can streamline the process so it's not quite as time consuming. There's a lot of strengths that I hope you've heard as well. Again, when the research question and your project and your focal sample warrant a qualitative research approach, it can be ideal. I do want to mention that one of the ways to address some of these pitfalls and to be able to take part in qualitative research is that we now have some resources which haven't always been the case. And so I'm really happy to share that we now have the Qualitative Methods and Analysis Center, QMAC. We're just over a year in the development and opening of QMAC, and we are swamped already, which is a really good thing to happen. But what I love about this is we now have, just like you can hire statisticians to help with your grants and your research, we actually now have a center that you can hire qualitative methodologists to help with your work. And so we're kind of like a consulting firm embedded within Children's, but we also work across UC and the VA as well. They're specifically here through the CCTST. We now have Bird is doing qualitative consultations because I do them. So it's a big success. We now have a checkbox if you work through Bird for research services, and you go through CCTST as a member and ask for help. There's now a checkbox for qualitative research, and that is a way to kind of initiate some of these services. We also, I mentioned that I have a joint appointment across the street. There's a whole research methodologies unit that we have. It's under the Educational Studies PhD program. So I think a lot of people don't necessarily find us because they hear education and they think that it's all teachers. Quite honestly, if UC had a transdisciplinary college, that's probably where this unit would be. And so within the research methods unit, which is under educational studies, we actually have a quantitative and mixed methods research concentration. And then we also have an educational and community-based action research concentration, which I'm primarily associated with. So I just have some samplings of the types of classes that we offer. And by the way, all of you are welcome to take those. even if you're in totally different programs, they often can count as an elective for sure. And then they also, in many cases, can count, you can substitute them for some of your research requirements, depending on your program. And that differs, you know, from program to program. But I certainly can help with some of that if you ever have questions. And I can also refer you to my colleagues. So I like to share that there are some resources. I also sent a PDF and I have highlighted some of the key references. There's the Creswell at the top, Qualitative Inquiry and Research Design, Choosing Among 5 Approaches that I mentioned. I also think Maxwell is a great a smaller book that's very fun to read. And I like what he calls an interactive approach. It's a very integrated approach, that idea that every piece of the research process should hang together. And then there's a couple, the other one I have highlighted, it's from Medical Education, but it's kind of nice because it's a good overview article, and you can access that on your own as a PDF instead of, you know, if you don't want to buy a full book. And there's others here as well. And then these are my kids from a long, long time ago. So I always look at that and I believe, you know, I remind myself life is short and it goes by really fast because they're all old now too. So thank you. And please feel free to reach out to me. I'm on email and I'm always happy to answer questions that come up, whether they're specific to qualitative research or about research in general, because my motivation is that I want people to do high quality research, and I want people to do research that matters to them. And particularly, how can we incorporate all the different stakeholders, especially patients and families, into our research processes? So thanks. And I think I'm 1 minute over my promise to finish at 4:50.
Yeah. Good to see you.
Good to see you guys too. Take good care, everybody.
You too.